Welcome to the Massachusetts School of Law's presentation of Educational Forum. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to look at Iran and, with our guests, try to gain some understanding about that country and the challenges it poses for us. A good many years ago, I spent almost 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer living and working with Iran and with Iranians. And I developed a fondness for its people and culture. Since that time, much has changed in Iran, and much has changed here and in the rest of the world as a result of the changes in Iran. In 1979, the Shah of Iran, who with his father before him had ruled Iran for more than 50 years, was driven from the country in a popular uprising. The Shah was seen by many Iranians as the instrument, a puppet of the United States. And in the aftermath of the Shah's departure, what was designed as a student sit-in to push for the Shah's return to stand trial in Iran became the seizure of the American embassy and the infamous 444-day hostage crisis. That event has had effects far beyond the time it occurred and the people directly involved in it. And to this day, it drives our perception of and policy toward Iran. But what are we missing when all we see is what we remember of the news coverage from that time? If our whole picture of Iran is based on that single piece of what a recent author called the Persian puzzle, are we destined to repeat the kind of foreign policy blunders that arise from false pictures of the world outside our borders? Here today to help shed some light on the realities of Iran and on the implications of the traumatic events of 1979 are three Americans who've had occasion to take some long, hard looks. First, in alphabetical order, is Charles Dunbar, former U.S. ambassador and diplomat who was a foreign service officer in Iran before the revolution and now teaches international relations at Boston University. Welcome, Ambassador Dunbar.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
And next to him is David Harris. Mr. Harris is a former contributing editor to the New York Times Magazine and Rolling Stone, and is the author of several books, the most recent of which is The Crisis, a gripping narrative of the hostage crisis subtitled The President, the Prophet, and the Shah, 1979 and the Coming of Militant Islam. Welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Terence Ward, now a cross-cultural consultant, who grew up in Saudi Arabia and Iran, where his father worked for oil companies. In 1998, nearly 20 years after the revolution, Mr. Ward and members of his family went back to Iran, in part to find the Iranian man and his family who had been their cook, housekeeper, and guide to the culture of Iran. His rich book is called Searching for Hassan, A Journey to the Heart of Iran. Welcome to you, Mr. Ward, and thank you all for coming today.
Thank you.
I'm Andy Starkis, host for today's program. Ambassador Dunbar, could you tell us a bit about what you were doing back in Iran while the Shah was still in power?
Sure. I came to Iran in 1963, relatively new in the State Department. It was my first posting, and spent 4 years there, 1 year in Tehran and 3 years in Isfahan. I had been trained in the language, and particularly after I got to Isfahan, was lucky to become fluent in the language. My work consisted essentially in being the number 2 person in a 3-person consulate. And it's interesting to note at that time that in the 2/5 of the country, which was our so-called consular district, there were 150 Americans only. So I have never lived closer to a society than I lived to the Iranian society at that time. My job was to find out what was going on in the country, in particular the White Revolution that you referred to, and in more particular, the land reform, which was, I would say, had a rather profound effect on the country. I was also concerned about the activity of tribes, particularly the Qashqai Turkish-speaking tribe, which was in the central part of the country, and got to make a migration with them, an unforgettable experience for me. and then generally following the politics, such as they were, national and local politics, and the economy of the country. So that was, in a nutshell, what I was doing, and I enjoyed it very much.
Now, having sort of experience of Iran and Iranians at various levels, could you tell the listeners, the viewers, a little bit about the different levels of society in Iran? You say you were in Tehran, you were in some of the provincial capitals, you had some dealings with the tribes. How does that break out, or how did that break out then?
Well, at several points. I think, first of all, my time in Tehran gave me a preview of coming attractions in Iran, because as you remember, in 1963, there were the big riots in the Tehran Bazaar having to do with the Iranians had wanted, the Iranian religious establishment had wanted the Ayatollah Khomeini, Ruhollah Khomeini, to become what was called the Peshwa-e-Muslimin, the head of the, in effect, of the religious establishment. That was denied to him, and he was exiled at that time. And there were very, very widespread riots, and it was those riots were brutally suppressed with probably four-figure casualties on that particular day.
Thank you. And we'll be back in a moment to continue our discussion.
Misfits in America is the first volume of a quartet called Thine Alabaster City's Gleam, written by the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law, Lawrence R. Velvel. Misfits in America, like the entire quartet, is a collection of stories, events, and incidents that illustrate basic problems which arose in America in the last half of the 20th century and continue today. Misfits in America discusses the extensive decline in honesty in our country, the increasing extent to which success is not determined by competence and diligence, the replacement of modesty by celebrification and bragging, the rise of elitism, and the growing concern with one's self to the exclusion of any concern whatsoever with the welfare of others. It also discusses in the national political sphere the gross failure of judges and congressmen to do their constitutional duty, so that we suffered the debacles of Vietnam and now Iraq. Misfits in America has been praised by leading American scholars and authors like Howard Zinn, Amitai Etzioni, Richard Falk, Lyle Denniston, Robert M. O'Neill, and others. It has been called a page-turning account. To obtain a copy of Misfits in America, contact the publisher, the University Press of America, at 4501 Forbes Boulevard, Suite 200, Lanham, Maryland, 20706, at 800-462-6420, or at its website. Or contact the Massachusetts School of Law, 500 Federal Street, Andover, Mass. 01810, 978-681-0800, or at their website, www.mslaw.edu.
Welcome back. We've been discussing Iran here, and I'd like to now, if we could, turn our attention to some of the more recent events toward the late 1970s. And Mr. Harris, your book, The Crisis, which provides a you are there account of the events of the Iranian Revolution, and in particular the hostage crisis. Could you tell us what triggered those events? What were the immediate triggers?
Well, the immediate trigger is the overthrow of the Shah by this enormous popular revolution that lasted a year, and by dint of its capacity to turn out huge numbers of people into the streets of Tehran in violation of military curfews in violation of martial law, forced the Shah to leave the country and abandon his rule. And an example of just how popular this was when the Ayatollah Khomeini returned from...
this is the same fellow that we heard about in 1963.
Absolutely, and that most Americans
Yes.
still remember from the picture they saw repeated over and over again during that time. When he finally returned from exile after the Shah had been forced out of the country, he was greeted by a crowd estimated by the Le Monde reporter there at being 10 million people. We're talking the populations of greater Los Angeles and Chicago combined out in the streets to welcome one man home. An extraordinary kind of demonstration of the power of people that we have seen played out a lot more recently in other societies. But this was the original of those. And at the end of it, we were left with a couple factors that became extraordinarily important in what was to follow, which was first that for the first time Islam had surfaced as a political agenda inside a society. And second, the behavior of the Americans and their policy had become a dominant issue in that society and the societies surrounding it. So suddenly the context changed enormously.
In the turmoil that ensued, as we know, our embassy came to be taken over. How did that come about?
Well, it started because of the American decision to allow the Shah, who was in exile and moving around the world trying to find some place to land, we allowed him to come to the United States to take medical treatment for his cancer, which ultimately became fatal to him. And when we made that decision, we made it with an understanding that we couldn't protect the embassy from public responses in Tehran if we did this. We took the step anyway, and it was responded to by a group of students calling themselves the Muslim students following the line of the Imam, who decided to launch a sit-in and take control of the American embassy.
They weren't looking to take hostages, were they?
They thought they'd maybe last there 72 hours before they were thrown out, maximum. And suddenly this seized the imagination of Iran. Within 24 hours, mass migrations to the embassy had begun, huge crowds developing outside, and suddenly they were the epicenter of the Iranian Revolution.
How did the Iranian government get involved?
Well, we're using government in a loose form here because there wasn't really anything that amounted to a government. There was a provisional government that managed certain aspects of the state, but there was no central locus of power that was able to make decisions or engage in negotiations ultimately. What there was great disorder throughout Tehran. There was the charismatic figure of the Ayatollah Khomeini standing above it all. There were a number of other political factions, each maneuvering to try and get their hold on what Iran was going to become in the aftermath.
But even at that stage, wasn't Khomeini kind of a final authority for things?
He was the ultimate authority. He was the figurehead of the revolution to whom all political factions, and this was an enormously wide revolution. We're talking everything from the extreme Marxists on one end to the extreme theocrats on the other end, all subscribed to him as the leader of their revolution and the most important political and spiritual figure. I mean, it's hard for Americans to understand what this man was, but he was like the president and the pope all in one package.
Now, this continued for nearly a year and a half. What was going on behind the scenes after that takeover as far as the Americans were concerned?
Well, the Americans were looking desperately to find somebody to negotiate with to get their hostages back. They tried through the UN, they tried through the PLO, they tried through every place they could think of to find somebody to talk to with whom they could strike a deal. But because, they had, in the days before the Shah left, had refused to make connection with the insurgent forces. When they had the opportunity, they had negotiations scheduled with Khomeini's people in Paris, which President Carter canceled because he thought it would undercut the Shah. So we had no connection with the people that might have helped us. And we were looking for a new set of people who would, and we couldn't find anybody with a stable enough political platform in Iran to make it work. And we had running against us at this time a political agenda in which the seizure of the American embassy was an extraordinary piece of leverage for the internal politics of Iran, so that we had to deal with not only their international stance, which was sort of patched together by an incipient government, and with the internal politics, which really defined the situation. So it wasn't until the hostage crisis was more than half done that there was ever anybody for us to really talk to who had the power to deliver.
After about 6 months, the focus shifted from diplomatic efforts. Could you tell us what happened?
Well, the Americans ran out of patience, essentially, after a close call with secret negotiations that almost succeeded, but never quite did. The Carter administration lost its patience and decided it was going to launch a military rescue mission, which had been in the planning stages since the hostages were first seized. This military rescue was a complex operation. There was the first use of the Delta Force, the American counter-terrorist outfit that had just been organized inside the United States Army. And the hope was to send a group of commandos into Iran who would secretly prepare themselves, get in position, and then attack the embassy, get the hostages, and take them out of the country, which was, as people who remember that time will remember, was a great failure. They never made it past their initial rendezvous point out in the Iranian desert before the equipment failure forced them to turn around and come back. Had they gone forward with it, the only internal government estimate of what would have happened was the CIA's guess that 60% of the hostages would have been killed in the process.
Now, my recollection from the coverage at the time was that part of the reason for the failure had to do with politicians getting mixed up with the military planning and operation. Was that in fact true?
No, it wasn't. In fact, the Carter administration, to the great surprise of the military professionals involved, had handed the task completely over to the military. Once they accepted this was going to happen, all the operational details and running of were all handed over to the military in terms that the commander on the spot described as ideal for any military commander. So there wasn't a great deal of political interference. There was obviously a political decision made to launch the strike in the first place. But once that decision was made, Carter didn't mess with the military and let them carry it out. It was a failure of equipment and perhaps a failure of planning. This was, in fact, far too big a step for us to be able to take. It involved flying a longer helicopter mission than had ever been flown by any American pilot or any American armed force. And it simply didn't work because the helicopters broke down and there was no place to go. But we may have been saved by that. It may have been a far worse event had they been able to get further into the rescue than they were.
I think there's one point to bear in mind. Looking back at this, it seems as if it was a harebrained scheme. And I think a lot of things that we do in our foreign policy seem to be, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, to be harebrained schemes. But one little point I would make on that fascinating account is you need to remember the domestic American political context of the time. Enormous pressure on the Carter administration to, quote, do something. Don't just stand there, do something. Diplomats often say that it's better, don't just do something, stand there. And the problem was, of course, he was facing an election against a popular Republican candidate who was, as we know, a person favoring tough action. And therefore, there was strong pressure, I think, to do something, and that colored
absolutely
judgment.
And as one Iranian emissary described it, the street was in control in both countries. And the street in America demanded that somebody get these guys and do something to them. And Carter had to resist that all along and ultimately lost his presidency over it.
What went on in terms of negotiations and other behind-the-scenes moves after the failure of the rescue mission?
Well, there was a hiatus for almost 4 months where there was no contact between the two sides at all, during which time the Shah died of his cancer. Then in the fall of 1980, there was a secret approach by an Iranian emissary of the Ayatollahs who met in Germany with Warren Christopher, who was then the Assistant Secretary of State, and essentially cut a deal. The deal was in place. They were ready to go. As the Iranian emissary was waiting for his plane in Germany to fly back to Tehran, suddenly word came that the Tehran airport was closed because the Iraqis had attacked Iran. And suddenly this attack by Iraq threw everything out of whack. It was several weeks before the Iranian emissary could get home, and by that time the political context in Iran had changed totally, and this was now a back burner issue. It was no longer a front burner issue. And so it took another 4 months after that before we could get a final deal that could happen. And in the meantime, Carter lost the presidency, and his last lame duck act as president was to finalize these negotiations that got the hostages home.
Now, your book goes into a number of attempts that were made over the course of time to negotiate a release, and how some of these attempts came to failure by the most mundane kinds of mistakes. And one in particular I'm thinking of had to do with the involvement of the Panamanian strongman Omar Torrijos. Could you tell us a little bit about what that arrangement was and how it fell apart?
Well, after the hostages were seized and the Shah was in the United States in New York getting treatment for his cancer, the Carter administration decided that they could not make a deal and get out of this with the Shah still in the United States. So using the connections they had made with Torrijos in the course of the Panama Canal negotiations that had happened during the first year of their administration, they approached him, asked him if he would accept the Shah. He said he would accept the Shah. The Shah went to Panama. Then behind the scenes, the Panamanians started negotiating with the Iranians and had agreed to arrest the Shah at the Iranian behest and to subject him to an extradition process, which would have drastically changed the politics inside of Iran surrounding this question. But the Iranians made the mistake of announcing this at the wrong time. When they were told to announce it at 7:30 in the morning, they assumed they meant 7:30 in the morning Tehran time, when in fact the Panamanians meant 7:30 in the morning Panamanian time. So the Iranian announcement came out far too early, put the Panamanians in an uncomfortable political position, and they squelched the whole thing at that point.
But one thing that's interesting in all of this is the end result of this media circus being used by both sides ends up with conservatives coming to power and the Republicans coming to power in America, and a conservative consolidation of power in Iran. And many have argued that this relationship is more symbiotic than meets the eye. And what happened is both regimes that deal with black and white, that deal with the politics of fear, that use the politics of fear, speaking about the Republican majority, and also the conservative mullahs that are running the government today. The politics of fear is the mechanism of holding power. And so there's a mirror that's required. Black needs white, white needs black. And the question of what else was happening, did the American people know that these were actually staged events, that Ted Koppel made his entire career out of these chanting moments where before the men started to chant death to America, picnics, baskets were being passed out by the ABC crew, Cokes were being drunk, and then they would be told, okay, now ready? Let's start chanting. So how much of this was utilized by the politicians on both sides becomes one of the under issues that needs to be explored. And finally, how did that serve to create these stereotypes that we're still carrying today?
But the context was hysteria in all circles.
Yes.
Yes. Anybody who tried to deal with this issue at the time had to swim upstream against a kind of hysteria that is hard for us to grasp at this point. I mean, American polling at this time was extraordinary, where you get 90% of the American population responding to polls saying not only did they know what was happening in Tehran, they had very strong opinions about it, and they were pissed off, and that was it. You know, and that provided a kind of political backdrop that no American could quite get their way around.
Mr. Ward's comment gives us a useful segue, I think. I'd like to come back after the break, I'd like to come back and talk a bit about what lessons we can draw from this experience. But I want to spend a little bit of time now focusing on the Iranians themselves, getting some understanding about the Iranian people. And Mr. Ward, your recent book, Searching for Hassan, talks about your 1998 trip to Iran. Can you tell us what that was all about?
Well, like both yourself, Andy, and David, is it? Charlie. No, the three of us spent time in Iran. And those memories were so profound that it's brought the three of us here today. Growing up as a child, I grew up under those Elborz Mountains. I remember them with these incredible cradling arms. I mean, these are images that are etched into your psyche. But what happened also is we were raised, fortunately, by this extraordinary man named Hassan, who was both a cook, a gardener, but he was also a storyteller. He was an extraordinary guide into his culture, and he taught my brothers and I many things, and really they became part of our family. After we left Iran in 1969, the question of the family always haunted us, especially after the revolution. I think for many people here, probably you went through the same experiences. What has happened to the country? Has it totally transformed? Are these people alive, dead? What has taken place? That always haunted us. And finally, in 1998, my mother announced that she was going back, whether her boys were going to join her or not. And she made that position. She chose the date with my father, April Fool's Day, for the voyage. And she decided that she was going to go underneath this politics of fear. She was convinced that she could find this family with no address, with no phone number, with no contact for over 30 years. And that began a journey that really was quite extraordinary, full of miraculous events. But it also opened up a window into that timeless soul of Iran, to the Iranian people that we're about to discuss, because in fact, when we arrived back there, and of course I had a brother who was absolutely catatonic. I mean, he was terrified. Chris was always waiting for something to happen. But in fact, once we arrived, the first thing that happened is people would stop us on the streets. Where are you from? We'd say, America. Huh, really? Do you know my brother Ali in Chicago? You know, welcome home. Some would even say, we're so sorry about what happened 20 years ago. And then somebody would start speaking to you in French and then Italian. And we discovered this whole younger generation, so warm, so inviting, so that hospitality, the tarof, that we had hoped was still very much alive. We discovered it very much alive.
And when we come back, we're going to learn a bit more about Iran and discuss what all this adds up to. What does it mean for our policy toward Iran in the future with the current nuclear threats and terrorist threats, and we'll talk to you then.
Books of Our Time is presented by the Massachusetts School of Law. The winner of 25 awards since 2002 for excellent television programming, Books of Our Time brings you leading authors for one-hour discussions of major books they have written. The authors include Pulitzer Prize winners, historians, political scientists, lawyers, scientific writers, reporters, and other experts in a variety of fields. The subjects of their books include American wars and foreign policy, American domestic history, economic subjects, college and professional sports, biographies, higher education, and many other fascinating topics. Books of Our Time helps carry out MSL's commitment to provide excellent television programming that provides the public with information on important subjects. Watch Books of Our Time on Sundays on CN8, the Comcast network, at 11 a.m. for interesting, in-depth, and sometimes humorous discussions of fascinating topics. The Massachusetts School of Law offers opportunity to persons who would otherwise be frozen out of law schools and the legal profession. When making admissions decisions, MSL looks at all aspects of the candidate's academic and work histories and does not consider the LSAT. We also make law school affordable, with tuition that is only half or less of most other New England law schools. MSL's teaching and standards are rigorous. Our students learn to analyze deeply, to write well, and to speak fluently. As lawyers, they compete on equal terms with graduates of any other school. They also use their training in business, government, and other fields. An education in MSL can put you on the road to a better professional and business life. For information about MSL's full-time and part-time programs, call us at 978-681-0800 or write us at 500 Federal Street, Andover, Mass. 01810. Or for information and to see the school online, visit our website at www.msl.edu.
Welcome back. When we went to break, Terence Ward was just beginning to tell us about his trip back to Iran in search of Hassan. Mr. Ward, could you tell us a little bit about Hassan's background?
Yeah. Andy, he came from a very small town. My mother never quite remembered the name of that town, and that's why the search was so improbable. And we were able to find him only through a black and white photograph from 1963 in a country with 2 million Hassans. So just to give you an idea of how daunting this whole journey was. But he came from very humble origins. Like many in those days, he never had gone to school. At the age of 6, his father had dragged him off to Tehran to work first as a shepherd, and then he ended up working as a gardener, and finally became a chef by the time he came to work for us. His young wife, Fatima, had never gone to school either. At the age of 6, she was weaving carpets in their little village before he was to marry her. So that also gives you a portrait of how difficult the lives were for many of the people who ended up coming into Tehran, who became part of this revolution that we are speaking of. What was so incredible is once we ended up meeting that family again and reuniting, we discovered that all of Hassan's legends, poetry, all of this rich culture that he carried, because although he wasn't educated, he was still a repository for these incredible stories, that whole oratory tradition, the poetic tradition that you're so familiar with, that Iran is so blessed with. All of that was very much alive, but his children, all of a sudden we were sitting next to our equals. Mariam was a master's degree from Isfahan University.
Now these are the children
a
of
teacher,
Hassan.
yes, the children. Little Mahdi had received his master's degree in electrical engineering from Tehran University and was in charge of the entire telecommunications at the largest steel plant in the country. All to say that this would have been inconceivable under the previous regime. Many changes did happen for you could say for the underclass, but that doesn't mean that there isn't criticism. And I'll tell you, we heard, unlike what you had experienced when you grew up in Iran, and I did, of people terrified to open their mouths in criticism. The jokes and the criticism is overflowing.
In your book, you mentioned one you heard from a taxi driver.
Well, I mean, he was talking to me about a gentleman who had gotten into the cab and was complaining because he had to spend 3 hours on the street waiting for a taxi. And he said, well, why did you have to wait 3 hours? And he said, well, because I was wearing my long black robes before, but then I had to go in and change, and now that I've come out, you've picked me up. And the taxi driver told me, he said, if he had told me that, I would have never picked him up. Also, there's this very profound, clear view that politics is a dirty business, and that anybody who's gotten involved in it, especially those in the clergy, are mixing up with holding on to power, acquiring great sums of money, and all the corruption that's attached to that. And that hasn't been lost on this younger generation. Now, what's extraordinary is this younger generation, even though we imagine this country sort of cordoned off, is cosmopolitan, it's educated, incredibly aware, and very politically astute. And everyone knows, in that country and outside, that change will come.
Now, you mentioned your mother was the kind of the driving force behind this trip. Also, in your book, there's a story about stopping in the village where the family, the village where the president of Iran, Khatami, not Khomeini, Khatami, came from, and hearing that the president's mother still lived in the village, your mother insisted on going to visit her. Could you tell us that story, please?
Much to the dismay of my nervous brother Chris, yes, she did. She announced that she was going to go and visit the mother of the president. Now, to put everything in context, in 1998, something extraordinary had happened. I mean, America's calling for democracy all over the Middle East. What had happened in Iran was unthinkable. A democratically elected reformer, completely in opposition to the to the hardliners, had been swept into power. 70%, 75% of the people had voted for this rather unknown candidate.
We say into power, into office at least.
Into office, yes. In retrospect, the power he never was able to exercise, but there was great hope for change. So this was a moment where people were talking about Tehran Spring. They really thought that maybe this gentleman would be a Gorbachev and start to unravel the power base that had controlled the country for about 20 years. So my mother said, listen, I want to stop. I want to go inside this home and just speak woman to woman with the president's mother. Of course, my brother was absolutely catatonic. No, you can't. What if there's secret police? What if, we're going to be arrested? Our guide jumped off the bus. He said, absolutely not. I'm not going any further with you. We found a Haji, an old man, who guided us to the gate. A very humble house, no riches to speak of. My mother got down, went inside, and the rest of us, all her men, brave men, were sitting out in the car wondering, as the watch went by, when we would be brought in for questioning, when we would be surrounded. Nothing happened. After an hour, she came out, and my brother Chris looked at her. She was just beaming from ear to ear. And my brother Chris looked at her and said, but what did you do in there? What did you talk about? What happened? And she said, Chris, I talked about what mothers always talk about. I talked about family, friendship. I talked about hope for the future. And I congratulated her on having raised a nice son. All to say that sometimes if you travel under that politics of fear, under that radar, the politics of fear, I think what would stun most Americans is the incredible reception and the great affection that the people of Iran have for Americans. Outside of the politics, there is an enormous friendship that's there. There's incredible hospitality, and people are clever enough to draw a distinction between politicians and the ordinary people on the street. So this was really a journey against all odds, crossing the divide to find those common elements of humanity. And they are there. And they're there absolutely thriving. And I think that anybody who's gone, all of us who were speaking about this at the break, anyone who's gone to Iran is just overwhelmed with the hospitality and the warmth that one has received. And this doesn't connect with anything that we've seen on television. And so,
unfortunately, I mean, we're in this current moment where here we are, we're almost in a state of war with Iran. And we haven't talked to them officially in 25 years. Right. We have an enormous cultural bond with these people in the form of Iranian immigrants who are a significant part of American society, who move back and forth. You have this cultural affinity, and we're not taking advantage of any of it in the strategic or tactical sense.
Ambassador Dunbar, does hearing any of this surprise you? You haven't been back to Iran since the Shah left, is that correct?
Correct.
Does any of that description surprise you?
No, it doesn't at all. I think the openness is clearly there. I was very surprised. I had my finding Hassan moment myself because a friend from Isfahan had wanted a favor from me, which I had been able to do, and he wanted to speak about it. And I finally spoke to him on the telephone, and I was very struck by the degree of openness and hostility to the regime that he expressed, and in fact twitted him because he had been very hostile to the Shah's regime when I was there before. And I said, well, at least you were able to speak more openly than you never would have had a conversation like this speaking about the Shah. And he said, well, I suppose that's true, and then got back to his denunciations of the regime. So that is clearly there. Unfortunately, I think and it's good, I think, maybe to talk a little bit about the current situation. The politics do tend to predominate, and I think that I guess we and the Iranians and our government and their government face a very large dilemma, and it's very, very acute for us, I think. General sense is, well, let's go and exploit this. Let's make it all work. Why do we have to be so mean to the Iranians? The problem is that I think it's pretty clear that this regime, which is deeply unpopular, wants to develop nuclear weapons.
But what regime in its right mind in the world today would not want to have
All
nuclear
true.
weapons? It's the only leverage you have against an aggressive American state, among other things.
All true, but let me just go on with the point a little bit, just beyond that. So you make whatever deal it may be possible to make, and I think that will be extraordinarily hard to do. In a way, then, you strengthen the regime, because the deal is obviously going to involve admitting Iran back into the community of the international community, as it's referred to.
But the Americans
so often.
strategically are in a far better position if they admit them back into the community. What we want, I mean, what worked with the Soviet Union in the Cold War will work with the Iranians.
And China as well.
The more contact, the better.
Well,
You know, the chances of us getting a kind of political solution in Iran that satisfies our needs in the situation only get better with the more openness. And we've made this issue of weapons of mass destruction into not an issue of weapons of mass destruction, but an issue of American hegemony and whether the Iranians are willing to accept it. Because we haven't spoken out against weapons of mass destruction. We accept the Israelis, we accept the Pakistanis, we say nothing about their illegal development of such weapons, but we pick out the Iranians, and the Iranians notice that. If we want a regional solution, let's get all of those warheads out of the region and ask the Iranians to kick in on part of that.
Right. We say, no, we now are once again prepared to have Pakistan have nuclear weapons. Of course, they have them. There was a period during the 1990s when we were extremely hostile to them, and this is another story, but I think it cost us the price of that policy was the rise of the Taliban and everything that followed. So all I'm saying is, I think, and I do want to say that I think the option of being open to Iran generally is the better of two fairly unpleasant options that we have to follow.
My point would be,
I don't think we can follow the confrontational policy.
No.
I think it's pretty clear that, first of all, if Seymour Hersh, if there was a grain of truth to what he wrote recently about all these operations inside Iran, we're going to make a frightful mess of that. We couldn't even find the weapons of mass destruction sites in Iraq when we were occupying the country, and the Iranians have gone to some length to hiding these. Furthermore, I think in the unthinkable idea of having some kind of military confrontation with the Iranians, that's going to need a draft. And that's going to mean that this policy of this administration, the politics of fear that you spoke of, will mean that we actually have to make people make some sacrifices. And I don't think that they're prepared to do that.
well, Cy Hersh is a friend of mine, and I can tell you if he wrote it, it's got more than a grain of truth in it. This is the best reporter of our generation, and a man whose guidance we ought to listen to far more. But I think the great mistake is for the assumption that this administration seems to be making, and some portion of the American public seem to be making, that because this is an unpopular regime in Iran, that somehow they will respond favorably to American aggressive military actions, which couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, take the historical...
Does any of you disagree with that proposition?
No, that
That
absolutely.
the Iranians would
say-
unite against the United States?
I would even
despite their
add
divisions?
two very important voices, just symbolically, two people that probably the Americans are aware of. Inside the country, you have the Nobel Prize winner, Shirin Ebadi, who said any American confrontation was going to put back our democratic reform process 10 years.
Yep.
So
Now, she's an opponent of the current
she's
regime.
an opponent, but another fellow who is the son of the Shah, Reza, who is here in the States, unlike all of the Iraqi nationals who were sort of cheerleading the invasion of Iraq, he came out and said, we don't need an American general marching into our country to teach us about democracy. This is a completely different situation.
This is the son of the deposed Shah.
That's right, who many conservative Iranian families would rally behind, hoping that he would be perhaps a successor. But he is also very much against any kind of intervention. And I think that Washington should adhere to that.
And
Look at the history of this. When the Iraqis invaded Iran, In 1980, it was the state inside of Iran prior to that was almost civil war. You had factions at each other's throats.
That's right.
The entire country was divided. Within 24 hours, there were lines around the block at all the recruiting stations of people, whatever their political opinion, who were going out to defend the fatherland, and did so by dint of suicide attacks against the Iraqi armor and stopped them in their tracks.
If I could, among those people was Hassan, was he not?
Well, he signed up to actually go to the front as a cook, and so yes, he did sign up. He did sign up.
But
he was injured, was he not?
He was, and the younger son had a terrible injury to his head and had ended up being actually held by the Iraqis for a number of years. But you're right, they paid a terrible price. But I think the point is the rallying cry of nationalism when there's an attack. Just look at what happened in this country from September 10th to September 11th. A president who had not been elected but selected by the Supreme Court, who was, say, favorably or unfavorably viewed by many of the American public, he all of a sudden gains, what, 30 points in popularity. Why? Simply because when attacked, we rally.
Would the bombing of a nuclear facility, as opposed to an invasion, trigger that kind of response?
Most of the Iranian population, it's clear in their own internal polling, believe that Iran has the right to nuclear power and the right to nuclear weapons, that they consider themselves to be a nation equal to all other nations, and any arrangement that assumes they are somehow a lesser peoples is not going to be accepted.
But how then does the U.S. respond to the situation where, if we say Iran should be able to have the nuclear bomb as Pakistan has it, India has it, Israel has it, despite what public announcements are, that the problem the U.S. has with accepting that is that Iran has engaged in a foreign policy of subversion, terrorism, if you will, the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia, which has pretty well been laid at the feet of the Iranians, that if they have nuclear weapons, what that does is prevent the U.S. from retaliating for terrorist strikes in a limited manner, because then there would be the threat of nuclear war. How do we get around that dilemma?
Well, I think we haven't been responding to those terrorist attacks in any form whatsoever so far, so that to suddenly postulate a proposition that hasn't even yet happened, that seems to me a little off the bat. And I think the way to approach it is to recognize that these weapons are international issues. They are not bilateral issues between the United States and Iran. They are issues that involve the entire world. We have understood this characteristics of these weapons ever since they were developed. And we have resisted, for our own internal political reasons, any attempts to actively defuse this question around the world. So now is the time to do that. Let's go after weapons of mass destruction. Everybody thinks they're bad things, but they are bad things in the hands of anybody who has them, including the Americans. This is not a weapon that is somehow chained with the character of the people who use it.
I just would comment on that makes a great deal of sense in kind of I don't want to say abstract, but in terms of what would be a logical place for us to occupy in the world. The problem is, I think the political one, that this is not something that the administration is prepared to do, either philosophically, but more important, I think, from how it perceives its political strength, and that being the leader of a nation at war is extremely useful for for this administration. And so I think it's something that's going to be very difficult, and to see change. And then one more thing, lest it seem that I'm critical of only the Republicans, where is the Democratic Party in all this? But this gets a little bit more political probably than we want to get in the Massachusetts School of Law. So.
Well, it's so nuanced that at a certain point we have to ask ourselves, really, what will it serve? Now, I've heard even comments, what will an attack serve? Let's assume the attack. What does that serve? We've established that it probably will strengthen the current regime, as you said, very unpopular, for many years to come. It allowed them to suppress any dissidents, any reformers, all of that voice, as much as they can.
And furthermore, we can't do it. But,
well, and then you have another problem of openly committing to creating Chernobyls across a country. And I've seen even comments of, from some neocons speaking about the human element, removing the human element as well, which is sort of an umbrella of, what, 2 square miles, 3 square miles, 4 square miles? And at a certain point, there's a cost to that. How will that be seen around the world? What conceivably will have been done? And anybody will tell you that's close to Washington, they will say, whatever regime, even if there is a change, that whoever comes next will probably wish to pursue the same path. I also want to speak about the innate intelligence. This is something quite extraordinary. Do you know that at Stanford University, the electrical engineering department alone, the chairman of that department has said that without a doubt, the finest university in the world, preparing electrical engineers, undergraduate, is Sharif University in Tehran. 15 were accepted into the program, into the graduate program, last year, given straight green cards brought into the country. There's an innate intelligence to this country. It is not simply the black robes that we've been describing. And I think I'd have to agree with you. This requires nuancing. Where are the Democrats? Where are other positions? Joe Klein came out with a very interesting comment. He said, what about fatal embrace? He wrote this about 1.5 years ago. I said, Joe, what's fatal embrace? He said, what if we were to simply unilaterally recognize the country? Unilaterally. Regardless of the response on either side. Because in fact, what that would do is create, in this very complex political situation where hardliners are battling reformers, it would create the debate. Do we accept or don't we?
But I think independent of the politics in this country, it's important for us to make the point, whether the Democrats or the Republicans are out there subscribing it, to make the point straight to the American people. We have options here. The notion that it is inevitable that we end up at the throats of the Iranians and they at our throats is foolishness. Far from it. We ought to be the best friends of the Iranians. I mean, they ought to be our best friends in the region. All the material to do that is there, independent of all these guys in black robes. And for us to miss that opportunity will doom our children to years and decades and generations worth of conflict that needn't be there.
You mentioned options. Are there other options we haven't discussed?
I just want to say I think that's a little bit cataclysmic, and I think what we may end up with is kind of a morose standoff between the two sides. And that may not be, it may be politics of the art of the possible, that may be about where we get. And as long as we have that regime sitting and failing, the opposition, as we know, is now the opposition, I mean the Iranian people, let's not call it the opposition, is discouraged and tired. Sorry that Khatami was not able to do more than he was able to do. And it's just kind of morose, as I understand it. So I think that maybe where we're going to end up is just everybody kind of angry at one another, and the opposition then, I think, will ferment. I'm not saying that's the best, in quotes, policy for the United States to be pursuing, but it may be where we're going to.
Well, I think the option that we haven't spent much time talking about is simply the option of talking.
That's right.
We have not had an official conversation with the Islamic Republic in 25 years.
I want to say that I do want to make one tiny point about that. And I want to say that I've been a long time out of the traces, and I may be wrong. I do understand that there was a kind of minimalist dialogue that went on in Geneva under the auspices of the United Nations at the end of the Clinton administration.
They've always been speaking backdoor. The conversation is always going on. It's just that no photographs have caught anyone in the same room.
Well, but if it becomes a public dialogue, suddenly it becomes an entirely different proposition.
The United Nations announces the talks when they take place, used to announce. Now that that was suspended. I understand it did continue into the Bush administration.
But I think that the open statement by the American administration that they want a bilateral relationship, that they want to get all the issues between the two countries out on the table and talk to them, and they want to sidestep this encroaching prospect of war and conflict between the two cultures. It seems to me an eminently possible option that ought to be pursued, and that it's our shame that we're not pursuing it, and our shame that we're not putting pressure on our government to pursue it.
Now, if I could, we only have a couple of minutes left here. I'm curious what you gentlemen think in terms of not just the U.S. policy toward Iran, what you think may or may not happen within Iran itself in terms of its own government. We've talked already about the fact that there seems to be a lot of open dissent, taxi drivers sort of putting down the government and the rest, but no real political power that's not in the hands of the hardline religious establishment in Iran. Where do you see that going?
First, I would just say one sentence. This is already a big change, and I think an indication both of at the same time, of the progress that the country has made toward a more pluralistic and humane political system, and also to to a real extent, the limitation of the authority of this regime. And that's
Well, I think, again, the example of the Cold War is an excellent one. You know, when the government becomes discredited, which is what has happened in Iran, the religious government has certainly been discredited, that the culture begins to move without it, and that ultimately the capacity to control that becomes more and more limited. And the more contact we have, and the more we draw the Iranians into the international scene, and into the international community, the more that exposure is going to be the case, and the more the possibility of them evolving out of their current black-robed authoritarianism rises.
And one more thought: we have to keep in mind that the Chinese have not missed the calculation, and they have struck a deal that some say is $70 billion. It was reported in Fortune magazine. Others say it's $100 billion. Dollars for a future gas pipeline that will deliver energy to China. The Indians last week signed a deal for $40 billion. Why Condoleezza Rice went to India was to ask them not to do that. The fact of the matter is that all of this containment is, again, it's an old policy that has not truly worked. As we were talking earlier, when there's been openness, and there is fluidity from the 700,000 Iranian Americans who go back and forth, who are the most successful ethnic community in the last 50 years to have come to this country. I mean, the percentages of graduate degrees is double the national percentage of those earning over $100,000. Again, double Americans' national percentage. That is part of a sieve that never gets spoken about. But there is communication back and forth. If there is some kind of opening, we've always seen pressure that occurred in China. We've seen pressure that occurred in Russia. Is it possible that that will strengthen those other wider forces, civic society, civil society?
But the pressure we ought to apply now is from the American people on its own government to say mutual respect. Let's deal with these people as equals. Let us deal with them with a kind of respect that can make possibilities.
Thank you, gentlemen. That's going to have to be the final word. I'd like to thank Ambassador Charles Dunbar. I'd like to thank David Harris, the author of The Crisis, and Terence Ward, the author of Searching for Hassan. I'm Andy Starkis, the host for today's program, and thank you all for tuning in and watching.